Recording. Hi, everybody. We are very happy to welcome back Rabbi Moshe Cohen, who is head of the Jewish World Section, the International School of Holocaust Studies in Yad Vashem. He's going to be talking to us today about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as we prepare to commemorate Yom HaShoah on Thursday. So Rabbi Cohen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you again to everyone for inviting me back to participate in this ongoing series of classes. It's a privilege for me, and I appreciate it very much. Today, as Barbara mentioned, we're going to discuss the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This is a common topic for this time of year as we approach Yom HaShoah, which was planned. This commemoration was planned. It was a big discussion when exactly Yom HaShoah should be. There was a faction in the Knesset that wanted it to be to commemorate the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but at the end it couldn't be because it was Pesach, and they didn't want to create a day of commemoration on the day of Yom Tov of Pesach, so they pushed it off until after Pesach, which is the way we celebrate it today. So we're going to study about, and even though it's so close to Pesach, nevertheless, we have a title of Modern Maccabees. So let us begin. We'll start with Franklin Roosevelt, a good way to start the study. Roosevelt once said that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. And that's an important concept for us to keep in mind, because the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was not only a dramatic event at the time, but in the course of Jewish history, it was a dramatic event because it seemed to indicate an awareness, a reawakening of an awareness that comes hand in hand with idealism and with the sense of great commitment. And interestingly enough, this idealism, this assessment that something else was more important than the fear that they lived with day in and day out, was predominant among young people and youth groups. Many Jewish youth organizations came into being in Europe between the two world wars. These movements had different motivations, whether religious, social, cultural, or political. Some were communist or socialist, others were Zionist. Some movements were both Zionist and socialist. Others were not associated with any political movement or ideology. However, as the Nazis began persecuting Jews throughout Europe, members of all the Jewish youth movements took a leading role in resisting the Nazis and assisting their fellow Jews. Who were these youth groups? Well, there was quite a few of them. For example, I've chosen a couple. HaShomer HaTzair is very famous. It still exists today. It's a left-wing Zionist and socialist group. They were behind many of the kibbutzim, right? The old-time kibbutzim where the children were raised in communal settings and the parents lived separate from their children. And it was very much everybody shared everything. The traditional kibbutz, many of them were HaShomer HaTzair, right? Gordonia was more moderate than HaShomer HaTzair. There was also a bit of a social status difference, as you'll see in a couple of the groups, but they were also Zionists and socialists. Beitar, they were a revisionist group. Beitar is the youth group. It exists today as well. And it's the youth group of the Likud, right, of Jabotinsky, right? And Menachem Begin was the head of Beitar in Poland before he left Poland and came to Israel, a young man, for those of you who are familiar with the Begin story. Dror was Zionist, socialist, but its members were considerably less affluent. On the other side of the tracks, these were poorer Jews. they couldn't afford the type of activities Hashomer Hatzair might have participated in, nor because of their economic status, they were idealistic, certainly, but they understood the need to make a dollar, then a ruble. They understood the importance of income because they experienced on a daily basis the limitations that came with poverty. Not, they weren't um, bereft of money, but they certainly were less affluent than others. Hanoar Hatzioni. This was a different type of youth group. It was basically Zionism, the return to Israel, the creation of a homeland based around Hebrew culture. So they were traditional and they believed very much in Hebrew. They spoke Hebrew, et cetera, right? Akiva, Zionist and Hebrew culture. Again, a little bit more to the right than Hanoar Hatzioni, but these were the types of youth groups. They all were Zionist. They all believed in the resettlement of the state of Israel, and they had different economic looks and visions as to what the Jewish state should look like. Many of the Zionist movements were connected to specific kibbutz movements in Palestine, and part of their ideologies was to send members off to settle in Palestine. Thus, many of the movement's members participated in agricultural training programs in preparation for immigration. They would go to camps and retreats where they would learn farming, they would work the land, etc. The connection between members of youth movements was very, very strong, as was their belief that what they were preparing for was very worthwhile and important. They were. I don't know how many of you have ever been part of a youth group, NCSY or B'nai Akiva or USY or Young Judea, there's a tremendous bond that exists in members, and those who are particularly involved, it becomes life consuming. It's where their friends come from. It's what they do immediately after school. It's where their social interests lie, and it's where a great deal of their prowess and life accomplishment comes from. So it was a very strong connection, right? And their belief, their idealism that the Jewish people had a right. This was, of course, after World War I, after the fall of the monarchies, with the rise of nationalism in the world. The youth groups were a natural extension of that in the Jewish world. And these young people believed that the time had come for the Jewish people to have a country which was uniquely theirs, with their language, their customs, their calendar, a place where they had the opportunity to achieve the full expression of their potential, just like a German kid can in Germany, or a Russian kid can in Russia, or an Italian kid can in Italy. This attitude is probably one of the great reasons why during the war, youth movement members, despite their age, took a leading role in resisting the Nazis. They wouldn't settle for it because they had already tasted the dream of freedom and self-expression. Right before World War II broke out, in the fall of 1939, some 100,000 young Jews were involved in various youth movements. Even though the Nazis outlawed Jewish youth movements and their activities early on, the movements continued in secret. After Germany invaded Poland, signaling the beginning of the war, many youth movement leaders fled the cities of Western and Central Poland for the Soviet-held Eastern Poland. For the socialist youth groups, right? The if you will, the communist youth groups, going to Russia was much closer to their goal than staying in the West. So hoping to make it from there to Palestine. Originally, the Russians, right, the Soviets, were very much in favor. If you look at the Soviets, were the number 2 country to recognize the founding of the state of Israel. They were very in favor of the predominantly socialist state. So they thought it would one day be a satellite. Soon, however, some of the youth movements decided to send some of their senior members back to German-occupied territory to help their fellow young people trapped by the Nazis and reorganize them for a viable existence as secret underground organizations. Now, this is an important concept. These were young, strong, idealistic teachers, educators, and workers. They got things done, and they did it with a smile and a sense that we're all in it together. So not only did they go back to provide a strong help to the people that were entrapped by the Nazis, but they went for attitude. They went to inspire young people. They went to, if you will, keep spirits afloat so that they could somehow figure out a way to get these young people to Israel and to show them the spirit of the Zionists. The youth movements active in the various ghettos of Poland embarked upon serious activities, such as organizing study courses. Remember, all these things were illegal. The Nazis made them illegal. So everything they did, they were risking their lives, and people risked their lives to participate. But these are the definitions of humanity. The Nazis, they looked at the ghettos merely as a way station until they could figure out something to do with an unwanted population. The Jews said, this is our home now. Whether we like it or not, this is our home. And therefore, they wanted the affectations of home. They wanted to be able to live a life that allowed them to be human. And part of that is study. Part of that is seminars where they can consider great philosophical, ideological workshops. Others, such as they did programming to keep the kids active. They might have done daycares to the extent that they were possible so that parents could work. They did what they could to create a society whereby, as difficult as it was, as oppressed as it was, the Jews could create some kind of life. They were also in charge of publishing the underground newspapers because they knew that all the news that they got through the Germans was tainted. So they tried to get newspapers through publishing their own newspapers with news that they got by listening illegally to radios, to the BBC, etc. Right? In Warsaw, the youth movement set up a courier network to keep contact with other ghettos. One of the most important things they did, right? For example, you see a picture here of Frumka Platniko, right? She was a member of Dror, the youth group, and she was a fighter in the resistance movement. And one of the things she would do, when she would go, because she was a woman, and therefore she didn't have a Brit Milah, which would mark her. That's how the Nazis often decided who was a Jew and who wasn't, by making a suspect drop their pants, and if they had a Brit Milah, they would be killed. Women, of course, didn't have that, and therefore they were able to move more freely. And it took a great deal of preparation, how they looked, how they smiled, how they whether they looked at the ground. It wasn't a simple thing of just transferring information, and it showed great courage. They set up schools. Here you have an example of a school in the Kovno ghetto and a soup kitchen in the Warsaw ghetto. Remember what that meant. These people didn't have meat. They didn't. It was very, very humble. Sometimes it was just boiled water and maybe some rotten vegetables. But the people that went to the soup kitchen were people who had even less than that. Unlike many of the older, more established Jewish communal leaders who felt that this too shall pass, remember, the ghetto's circumstance was not the first time in Jewish history this had happened. So the older people said, look, this is unfortunate. We thought that through modern education and Western civilization and university, we thought that these times were over, but clearly they are not. But we've been through them before, and this too shall pass. The leaders of the youth movements saw the future with surprising clarity. They said, no, this seems to be different. This is not a typical anti-Semitic expression. This is the expression of a sovereign state in the 20th century functioning amongst other sovereign states. And we see there is a determination on the part of the Nazis to destroy Jewish life. And there is not such a determination on the part of the nations of the world to preserve it. So they said this is something different. They were convinced they had no real chance of survival under the Nazis. They predicted clearly, right? Avram Kovner, he clearly said that we will not, they are out to kill us all. We will not survive, right? Their only chance, therefore, was armed resistance, even until the death of their last man. Not that they wanted to die, but they didn't want to be at the whim of the Nazi. Thus, after the final solution was put into effect, the youth movements began organizing themselves for resistance against the Nazis. So what we're going to really talk about today is how these young people made a stand against tyranny, against hate, and against dehumanization. Let's get a little bit of that.
Before World War II, Warsaw was the center of the Jewish population of Europe. Jews had lived there for over 500 years. By the eve of the war, fully 30% of the city was Jewish. In 1939, the Germans conquered Poland very quickly, and World War II began. The Germans had planned to deport the Jews. However, the plans didn't immediately succeed, and so, as an interim measure, Jews were concentrated in cities and near railways, and these became ghettos. The ghettos were not an end in and of themselves. They were interim measures, again, on the way to deportation and then later on to mass murder. Once the ghetto became a reality, the Jews trapped inside were its prisoners. They could no longer come and go freely as they wanted to. They literally went to bed one night and woke up the next morning surrounded by walls. And now at the entrance to the ghetto stood very intimidating symbols of authority, German guards and Polish policemen. Any Jew who was found outside the ghetto was unceremoniously shot. The Jews were sealed inside the ghetto.
In April 1942, the population of the Warsaw Ghetto was approximately 400,000 people. This film was taken at exactly that time, April, May of 1942. This is what it was like at the height of the Warsaw Ghetto's population. Come on. Okay, I'm sorry it's not working. Okay, the ghetto, what you would have seen. Oh, no, it is. The overcrowding was unimaginable. There was no, the infrastructure was unable to keep up with the overcrowding. You have 400,000 people in a tiny area, right? Maybe this what was built originally to handle a fraction of that. And nevertheless, they were crammed in there. There was disease, there was overcrowding, there was tremendous lack of privacy, and people lived in the streets, died in the streets, starved in the streets. And because it was so crowded, rumors spread like wildfire. And one of the big rumors that caused great panic was something called the Grozhanowski report. The Grozhanowski report was an eyewitness account about the atrocities in the German Chelmno extermination camp. There were different types of concentration camps, as you know. The extermination camps were, the first one was Chelmno, and it's there that they experimented on how they could mass kill the Jews, and they used, that's where they introduced and used vans where the exhaust was put back into the back of the vans, and they drove around until people died. Then there was Treblinka, there was Sobibor, there was Birkenau. Part of Birkenau was an extermination camp, and part of Majdanek was an extermination camp. And that means that they were simply there to kill. So this report, the Grozhanowski report, came as someone, Salama Barwiner. He escaped from Chelmno, and he wrote in 1942, right, that he wrote under the pseudonym of Yaakov Grozhanowski, right? The fellow's name was Zalma Barwiner, managed to make his way from Chelmno to the Warsaw Ghetto, and he gave a detailed information about his week-long experience in the Sonderkommando, the Jews that were forced by the Nazis to administer the death of others, right, at the death camp, right? And he reported it to Emanuel Ringelblum in the Einig Shabbos group, and it got recorded. But at the same time, it also became known. And the idea that the Nazis were participating in mass extermination of men, women, and children was a shock. And the Jewish community met this news with disbelief, right? Dr. Ignacy Schlipper, right, who was a famous professor in the University of Warsaw and a Zionist activist, he reasoned, and his reasoning was really representative of a significant attitude of the overcrowded Jewish population in the ghetto. He said, it's impossible to liquidate a population of 500,000 souls. He said, we're talking the 20th century. The Germans will not dare to annihilate the largest Jewish community in Europe. They will have to reckon with world opinion. They'll have to reckon with the numbers, the fact that we are the largest Jewish community at this point in Europe. Of course, world opinion. And then he said the Nazis themselves deny it. So he based his reasoning on three rational thoughts: the sheer numbers of the Jewish community, the fact that in the 20th century, people know what's going on. The world understands, right? You can't do something one place and the world won't tolerate it. It's too barbaric. And lastly, their sense that Germany is a civilized country and that you don't mass destroy, you don't kill men, women, and children. And this is how they reasoned. This was their response. But still the rumors circulated. Until what point? Until the head of the Judenrat, Adam Chernyanko, he wrote in his diary on July 20th that he had to quell these rumors. And he went in the morning at 7:30 to the Gestapo. And he asked Gerhard Mende, who was a soldier there, a Nazi, how much truth there was to the rumors about deportation. Now, remember, he felt he could ask such a question because he worked with these people every day. And even though they looked at him as vermin, he felt that he had a relationship with them. And he asked him about the rumors. He replied that he had heard nothing. He turned to, Karl Brandt, who was the Obersturmführer, the head of the ghetto, and he too said he knew nothing. He went to Deputy Chief of Section 3, Scherer, and he expressed his surprise at hearing the rumors and informed me that he too knew nothing about it. Finally, I asked whether I could inform the population that their fears were groundless. He said I could, that all the talk was utter nonsense. I ordered Lechkin, who you'll hear about a little later, commander of the Jewish police, to make a public announcement. Now, please know that this was in July 20th. And this marks the very day, really, that he went in to get assurances that these rumors about mass deportation and mass murder were simply rumors. Almost just several days later, what happened was the Great Deportation. It's called the Great Deportation. It started 2 days later. What was the Great Deportation? So for that, the best thing we can do is hear the words of Abraham Lewin, who himself was there.
The news about the expulsion of Jews is spreading like lightning through the town. Jews run by, in confusion, terrified. The Jewish streets are an appalling sight. The gloom is indescribable. On Zamenhof Street, the Germans pulled people out of a tram and killed them on the spot. The roundup was halted at 3 o'clock. The savagery of the police during the roundup, the murderous brutality. They drag girls from the rickshaws, empty out flats, and leave the property strewn everywhere. How did Jews hide? In couches, in beds, cellars, attics. Six Solna Street, 99 victims. Today, 12,000 martyrs. The violence of the police, the breakup of families. Mędrowski Pola. It hurts so much. Only the workers in the workshops seem to still be safe. A meeting of Oinig Shabbos. Its tragic character. They discussed the question of ownership and the transfer of the archive to America, to the YIVO, if we all die. It's a wonder that people can endure so much suffering, living the whole day on a knife edge between life and death, and clinging with all their might to life in the hope that they may be among the 10 survivors. Early this morning, the Germans and the rioters spread through the ghetto. In the course of 5 minutes, they drove out all the occupants on Gęcha Street, between Zamenhof and Lubieczka Streets. They pay no attention to papers. Eclipse of the sun. Universal blackness. My Luba was taken away. I have no words to describe my desolation. I ought to go after her, to die, but I have no strength to take such a step. I will never be consoled as long as I live, to fall into the hands of such butchers. How tragic it is, a life together of over 21 years has met such a tragic end. The sight of the streets, the pavements are fenced off. You walk in the middle of the road. Certain streets are completely closed off with fences and gates, and you can't get in there. The impression is of cages. The whole of Jewish Warsaw has been thrown out of the buildings. There's a full-scale relocation of all Jews who have not yet been rounded up and are still in the town. The pain because of the loss of Luba is becoming more intense. My soul can find no peace for not having gone after her when she was in danger, even though I could have also disappeared, and Ora would have been left an orphan. There's talk of a second front in France and Holland. If these things had happened 4 or 5 weeks ago, perhaps we would have been saved from the catastrophe. 6 in the evening. Jewish policemen have returned from the town and said that the action is continuing. So, all our hopes that the bloody action has ceased now have been swept away. How will we survive? How will we be able to bear it? People talk of the special danger that now threatens children. A terrible dread seizes me when I think of the fate of Ora. She has no documents and is in danger. Since Friday, no news reaches us from the other side of the wall. The terrible appearance of the streets, transformed into an Umschlagplatz. The crowds of Jews with packs on their backs, streaming from the streets of the ghetto. Everyone who's camped out on the street. The Svetsha family has perished. He gave himself up after seeing how his wife and 2 children were taken. Initially, he went with us to Geisha Street. Later, he went back, gave himself up, and was sent away. I feel a great compassion and admiration for this straightforward person. We tremble at every noise and shot that comes from the street. Today is the 52nd day in the greatest and most terrible slaughter in history. We are the tiny remnants of the greatest Jewish community in the world. A Jew has returned to our workshop who worked as a gravedigger in Treblinka. According to what he said, not only Jews from Warsaw and of the Gubernia are being exterminated in Treblinka, but Jews from all over Europe, from France, Belgium, Holland, among others. Those who are far away cannot imagine our bitter situation. They will not understand and will not believe that day after day, thousands of men, women, and children, innocent of any crime, were taken to their death. Almighty God, why did this happen? And why is the whole world deaf to our screams? How terrible it is that a whole generation, millions of Jews, has suddenly become a community of martyrs who've had to die in such a cruel, degrading, and painful manner and go through the torments of hell before going to the gallows. Earth, do not cover our blood and do not keep silent, so that our blood will cry out until the ends of time and demand revenge for this crime that has no parallel in our history and in the whole of human history.
So let's look at the timeline. July 22nd to 30th was the beginning of the great deportation. 65,000 Jews were killed. Remember, we saw Adam Chernyenko's diary entry on July 20th. He committed suicide on July 23rd when he realized he had been lied to, and therefore he lied to others, and he was powerless to do anything to help anyone. July 31st to August 1st, 20,000 Jews volunteered in exchange for bread and a bit of jam, right? July 31st to August 14th, German and Lithuanian soldiers forcibly dragged off people without papers, and then they dragged off people with papers. It was meaningless, right? And in September, there was a great selection called the Kessel, which was particularly brutal. So we see that in a space of 60 days, from July 22nd to September 21st, almost 300,000 people were taken away. And then it stopped. Why? Because Treblinka couldn't handle it anymore. They asked the Jews, the people, the Nazis that ran Treblinka, said we can't take it anymore. There has to be a wait. So there were approximately 60,000 Jews left in the ghetto, and they were moved into the small ghetto, and they stood away. They knew that it wouldn't be over forever. They knew that, but it had stopped. So what happened during that lull?
When the people were being resettled, quote unquote, to the east, I once came home for lunch and found my parents beside themselves, unrecognizable, really. And my father said, "We have something to tell you. Actually, we have to tell you two things, because your mother and I have different stories. So let your mother speak first." And my mother just said, took some box and says, "Henry, these are poison pills. If you are caught by Germans, take them immediately."
The message was, don't believe the Germans. If you can, you have to hide. If you can, you have to escape. You have to run. If you want to try to save your life, because there is no life beyond Treblinka.
At that meeting, we started doing the same what the Poles were doing, just telling that the traitors should be killed. And during that meeting, it has been decided to kill Mr. Lakin. And Lakin was a head of the Jewish police at that time. After Sherinsky was almost assassinated and taken by the Germans. And Lakin was a small bastard, you can imagine. And then we cornered him. We cornered Lakin. And of course, I put my bullets into him, 1 or 2 bullets into him. Whether my bullets kill him or somebody else's bullets, I don't know.
So what did they do? They knew the Germans were to come back. They didn't understand why things had stopped. So they prepared. They understood that there was no longer the ability to live with and under the Germans. On January 18th, things began again. Over 1,000 German, Lithuanian, and Latvian soldiers and militiamen marched into the ghetto and demanded 8,000 Jews to assemble at the Umschlagplatz for deportation. It was now in continuation of the Great Deportation. Most Jews disappeared into hiding places, like we heard. The Germans launched a massive search and snatched every Jew they could find for deportation. As the Germans were leading a line of captured Jews to the trains, a group of ZOB fighters, one of the youth groups, opened fire on the Germans. For the first time in the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Germans encountered armed resistance by the Jews. Germans' forces retreated in confusion. Nevertheless, the action continued for 4 days. On January 21st, the action ended. Approximately 5,000 Jews were captured. Some Germans and most of the Jewish fighters were killed. But for the first time, the Germans met armed resistance. Now, at the same time that the Jews were fighting back, if you will, what was going on in the rest of the world? Remember, you heard Avram Lewinsky speak about what if the second front could have opened earlier. Well, all of a sudden there was a glimmer of hope from that direction. On the 2nd of February, right, the Nazis in 1943, the Nazis' 6th Army in Stalingrad exhausted their ammunition and food and surrendered after 5 months, 1 week and 3 days of fighting. The only 91,000 soldiers who became prisoners of war of the Russians, of an army of 250,000, survived the battle. Stalingrad was the largest defeat ever experienced by the German army. So there was a sense of defeat. And all of a sudden the Jews are rebelling. That created from the Jewish side some kind of odd optimism. And on the German side, some kind of great wariness. Mordechai Anilevich, who was the head of the ZOB, the Jewish fighting organization, which ultimately evolved into the Labor Party, right? The Tzahal, the Israeli army, etc. January 22nd, the Palmach. January 22nd, 1943, 6 months will have elapsed since the start of the Great Deportation from Warsaw. 300,000 of our brothers and sisters were transported to and brutally murdered in the Treblinka death camp. They knew about it. We received reports left and right about Jews being killed. As we listen to these terrible tidings, we wait for our own time to come. They knew that the lull would not last. So, Jewish masses, the hour is drawing near. You must be prepared to resist. Do not give yourself up like sheep to the slaughter. Our slogan must be, all are ready to die as human beings. Now, as he called on Jews to fight, after the Germans had left, they experienced a little bit, but enough to throw them into confusion. It's now they had left the ghetto, the deportations had stopped. Their last attempt to deport 8,000 people was greatly interfered with by the beginnings Jewish resistance. So Enelevich called for an overall uprising. And for the first time in a very long time, not only in the history of the ghetto, various factions within the Jewish people began to come together. Mark Edelman, who was the head of the Bund was very against the Zionists. They wanted to stay in Poland and create a Jewish Poland where they would speak Yiddish, and they were going to be good citizens of Poland. They didn't want to go to Israel, but we then decided, said Mark Edelman, that a joint battle organization should be formed and that its purpose should be prepared armed resistance for the time when the Germans might attempt to repeat the extermination procedure in the Warsaw Ghetto. They knew it was going to come. And they said, we have to join together. We realized that only through coordinated work and our utmost joint efforts could any results at all be expected. They realized that if they don't hang together, they will surely hang apart. Paul Frankel from the ZZW, the revisionists, the Jabotinskyists, right? Beitar, we're going to war. Adopt the slogan, rise up and fight. Do not despair of the chance for rescue. He who fights for his life has a chance of being saved. Find the courage to indulge in acts of madness. Put a stop to the degrading resignation expressed by such statements as, we are all bound to die. That's a lie. We too are deserving of life. You merely must know how to fight for it. He said, we got to fight. Maybe there'll be a miracle. Maybe after Stalingrad, the Russians will be able to push the Germans back. Maybe the Germans will stop trying to slaughter the Jews because they realize the war is lost. Maybe, but we have to fight. We have to join together with the Zionists. We have to join together with the Bundes and even the very, very religious community led by Rav Menachem Zemba, Gadol Yisrael, a giant of Jewish thought, a leader of world Jewry. He said from the beginning we should have used every opportunity and tactic to alert the conscience of the world. All we can do now is resist to the best of our abilities. We may not surrender ourselves voluntarily into enemy hands. He said the only hope is for us to resist as best as possible. And that really was a first time in centuries that Jews of all walks of life, even the destruction of the temple didn't see it, but all Jews of all factions came together. Now, this is part of the reason why the rebellion in Warsaw, which was not the only rebellion, but it was perhaps the most successful and famous rebellion, is because by this time, by January of 1943, it had achieved support of the entire ghetto population. From January 22nd to April 19th, 1943, deportations were halted from the Warsaw Ghetto. One can say, wrote Yisrael Gutman, right, about who was there in the ghetto, later came to Israel, right? He fought in all the wars in Israel and became the head of Yad Vashem. One can say without exaggeration that the entire population, from the young to the old, was engaged in preparing hiding places. The ghetto looked like an army camp. In the courtyards, one could see Jews carrying sandbags, bricks, and lime. They worked day and night, especially industrious were the bakers, because bread was purchased in great quantities for the preparation of rusks, right, which is a type of dried out bread, almost like matzahs in a certain way that could last a long time, but could provide some kind of sustenance. No one thought of willingly going to Treblinka. The survivors prepared everything necessary for remaining in hiding for months. They weren't going to go as they had before. How did they prepare?
There already to build bunkers underneath, because I guess this was truly the end. And the deportations continued. And when we were on Bonifateska, this was the first time that we heard about Treblinka. Because, you know, people like to fool themselves. None of us, I mean, this goes for my parents and everybody, we just couldn't believe that indeed that were herding us, transporting us to, as they call Vernichtungslagen, you know, the places where they are going to gas us, you know, kill us off.
The only chance to survive is to dig bunkers, and camouflage in a way that no one can yet 1, 2, 3 opening. And that was a mass action to start building bunkers. People out of a block of apartments, people of same kind, you know each other, families. So they started all digging and preparing, some hiding part of a floor or something, some rooms so no one could see, and of course underground.
Whoever had the possibility, the means, financial or otherwise, had friends, was trying to get to the Aryan side. I didn't have that possibility. I didn't have any money, and I didn't have any friends on the Aryan side. And I was trying to get into the Jewish fighting organization where my friends that were working with me.
So they made bunkers, they fought in any way they could, and they also began to mobilize for war.
Then, when the organization of the uprising started, my function was to go after curfew and paste the posters calling the Jews to armed rebellion on the walls of the buildings. My father, of course, was, he didn't know what I was doing, but when I was coming home after the curfew, it was a terrible thing. They were terribly, terribly worried.
What was it like? How could you maneuver yourself without being caught?
You were streetwise. You know, there were patrols, but it was dark, and we knew the streets. And we're going through the valleys, through the backyards, you know, risking our lives, but we were young, and one was going with a bucket and the brush to paste the wall, and the other one was running with the roll of posters and clipping them. You know, it was fun. You know, it was, we were too young, I think, to realize how dangerous it really was. It was a kind of a sport.
What did it mean to you?
Oh, I was adamant that the order of the day from Hashomer Atzair was that we are not going to be taken alive. You know, we are not going to be allowed to take on the transport. And I was all hyped up with it. I knew that this is exactly what I'm going to do. We are not going to go just like that. So there was just a conviction. We are just not going.
It was fun. They risked their lives, but they prepared. They prepared for all-out war as best they could. It came Pesach, the time of year we're in now, right? In Erev Pesach, Passover Eve in 1943. They had arranged everything in the house in preparation for the holiday. We even had matzot, right? Everything. We had made the beds. The policemen who lived with us, no one family lived on their own. They always had other people living with them, told us everything that was going to happen. He told us, you should know that the ghetto is surrounded with Ukrainians. Tonight will not be a good night. He had heard this. We took all of our belongings and went into the bunker where they were hiding. Why wait? So we took what we still had at home, whatever food we had, everything, and went down to the bunker and waited. And that's where they made their Pesach Seder, right? Tuvia Barzowski wrote, amidst this destruction, after even the fighting began, the table in the center of the room looked incongruous with glasses filled with wine, with the family seated around, the rabbi reading the Haggadah. His reading was punctuated by explosions and the rattling of machine guns. The faces of the family around the table were lit by the red light of the burning buildings nearby. We could imagine, or maybe we can't, what a Pesach like this was, how they understood the fight for freedom, for humanity, for independence of the Jewish people. On April 19th, wrote Simcha Rotem, right? Erev Pesach at 4 a.m, German soldiers crossing the Nalwiki intersection on their way to the central ghetto, walking in an endless procession. Behind them were tanks, armored vehicles. They came ready for a fight. Light cannons, hundreds of Waffen SS units on motorcycles. They look like they're going to war, I said to Tzipora, my companion at the post. Suddenly, I felt how very weak we were. What force did we have against an army, against tanks and armored vehicles? We had nothing but pistols and grenades. Yet they fought.
Now, after the 22nd, and we knew what's going on, where they go to Treblinka to that, so buy. But the Poles didn't want to sell us. The army, the Polish army. We paid for one revolver $3,000 to $5,000. For one bullet, $10. Now, during the main or so-called resettlement, there was a very complicated political situation in the Warsaw Ghetto because there were so many parties. And the Zionists, right and left, and revisionists, they couldn't get together. But on the 28th, they formed, somehow they came together and they formed 22 groups. One was called ZOB, the Jewish Fighting Organization, and the other one was called Irgun Zwei Leumi. This was the revisionists, which were the followers of Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor. So what was the main thing now? Buy arms, because the ZOB had 700 people and Zwei Leumi had 300. I could have thousands of young people, but there were no arms. The Polish government in London at that time sent us 50 revolvers with munition, 50 hand grenades, and 4 kilograms of explosive. We bought 4,000 on the Aryan side for money, 4,000 liters of gasoline. So when the tanks attack it, we'll burn it. Now, we trained the youngsters. As I said, we were preparing ourselves to fight. the underground, the 700 and the 300, they were trained. But what? We didn't have any guns, any, what do you call it, these guns, so
Rifles?
with sticks, huh?
With bayonets and rifles.
Rifles. We didn't have rifles, so they trained with sticks. So there was a bunker. In every building, there was a bunker where people had to hide in case of a new action, and there was a physician assigned to every bunker. I had 70 or 80 people in the bunker assigned to my bunker from my building. And, unforgettable, the first night of Pesach, the first Seder. But before I tell you about this, we had spies, Jewish spies on the Aryan side. And the German knew that they won't get us out so simple. They'll have to fight. And they told us how they prepared, the German, what they had against us is 2,000 SS soldiers. Listen to this, 3 detachments of artillery, 1,000 of German police, 1,000 of Polish police, and 1,000 of Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians in the black uniforms, the supporting police. Against them, we were 700 in the Jewish fighting organization and 300 in the other organization. But the Germans knew we won't come easy. And on the first Seder, on April 19th, 1943, we get a note calls from the other side. The Germans are surrounding the ghetto. So immediately, everybody went to the bunkers, and me, I had some medicine. What medicine did I have? Aspirin and nothing else. And some material, for wounds. And all the soldiers went to their posts. And on the 19th in the morning, I show you on my drawing there, through the Muranowska gate, next to the Umstadtplatz, a platoon of German soldiers came through the Muranowska street into the ghetto and went to the Muranowska square, singing, the northern people, the Obermenschen, Supermenschen, singing, happy. Now, when they came on the Muranowska street, there were 2 buildings there with flags. One Jewish flag with the Magen David, and one Polish flag. The Jewish boys knew that every bullet has to kill. Otherwise, they won't come out. So when they stopped singing and standing there on the Muranowska square, they came under fire. And it was hell for them because so many fell. They threw their guns and they ran away. Now, every piece of arms, every revolver, every gun, every submachine guns were collected. That's how the underground got submachine guns. There was not one was only in the whole ghetto. And uniforms, everything was collected. 2 tanks went on Muranowska Street, on Zamenhofer Street, also from Muranowska Gate, on Zamenhofer Street, I'll show it to you, to Mila 8. And there they were waiting for them, 2 tanks. They threw the Molotov cocktails on them and burned 2 tanks. So the Germans left. They were scared. They left the ghetto. And they knew they can't fight just on open streets. So they sent planes, and the planes started to bomb us.
Mordechai Alevich wrote, "It's impossible to put into words what we've been through. One thing is clear, what happened exceeded our boldest dreams. The Germans ran twice from the ghetto. One of our companies held out for 40 minutes and another for more than 6 hours. Several of our companies attacked the dispersing Germans. Our losses in manpower are minimal, and that is also an achievement. I feel that great things are happening and that what we dared to do is of great, enormous importance. What we need urgently is grenades, rifles, machine guns, and explosives. It is impossible to describe the conditions under which the Jews of the ghetto are now living. Only a few will be able to hold out. The remainder will die sooner or later. Their fate is decided. The fact that we are remembered beyond the ghetto's walls encourages us in our struggle. Peace go with you, my friend. Perhaps we may still meet again. The dream of my life has risen to become fact. Self-defense in the ghetto will have been a reality. Jewish armed resistance and revenge are facts. I have been a witness to the magnificent heroic fighting of Jewish men in battle. We are people. We refuse to be treated like animals. And they had tasted the success, not the winning of the war, but they tasted the success of dignity, of Kiddush Hashem, of the ability to say to the world that we are Jews, and that means something. This, he mentioned, we heard that they had spies on the other side. Here was one of those spies.
On the streets. And the whole city was in flame because the whole city was burning. So many blocks, not one, so many blocks. And I looked at these blocks. But the worst thing for me was the Easter Sunday, when I was in the church listening to all the sermons of the priest, and I blended in with them together. And I came out. The priest was standing in the front, greeting all the parishioners. And they were dressed in their best clothing on Sunday. Most of them took their children to their carousel, which was with music, which was around that. You could see with the naked eye what was going on in the ghetto, the flames and the burning, everything. And you were just listening to the expressions, Jews are burning, not burning. Jews are żytkische smażą. Jews are frying. I was in that environment of the people. Until today I cannot understand where did I take the strength not to scream, not to reveal who I am. That I look at my people burning and I cannot say anything. And here the carousel is running. The people are on the carousel with the parents happy.
Finally, on May 16th, the official rebellion ended, although it did last for a bit longer, but it ended when they destroyed the great synagogue on Tlamaki Street, and the Nazi general Stroop sent to Hitler the words, "The Jewish quarter in Warsaw no longer exists." He was ultimately hung as a war criminal for crimes against humanity. And that is fundamentally the Warsaw Ghetto. In retrospect, we turn to Yitzhak Zuckerman. He wrote and he fought in the Warsaw Ghetto and then came to Israel, and he and his wife established the kibbutz in northern Israel, Lochmei HaGhettot, the Warsaw Ghetto's kibbutz in northern Israel. He says, I don't think there's any real need to analyze the uprising in military terms. This was a war of less than 1,000 people against a mighty army, and no one doubted how it was likely to turn out. This isn't a subject for study in a military school, not the weapons, not the operations, not the tactics. If there is a school to study the human spirit, there it should be a major subject. The really important things were inherent in the force shown by Jewish youth after years of degradation to rise up against their destroyers and determine what death would choose, Treblinka or Uprising. I don't know if there's a standard to measure that. And his words have become really the inspiration behind the IDF and behind a great deal of the spirit in Israel, that one of the great advantages that we have here in Israel, when we create a society made by Jews for Jews, is that we have the right to self-determination. And we need to continue to learn that if we would only work together, if we would only help each other and trust each other, all that we can accomplish. That is the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And now I will try to answer any questions you might have. Just unmute yourself and you can ask if you have any questions.
Anyone?
Judith.
Yes. You mentioned the men in the Warsaw Ghetto. Were there women still there? Were there children still there? And if so, what were they doing during the uprising?
Yes, there were women and children in the ghetto, and many women participated, right? It was a different time, and the women were also responsible for taking care of the children and maintaining, so they were working in the hospital. There were women that were fighting as well, and they were taking care of the families. But there were women fighters, and there were what we know to a large extent about what happened in the ghetto is because women were able to get out and smuggle information, etc. There's a very dramatic diary entry about in the middle of the fighting, a fellow was in an apartment. It was different than today. And there was a phone in the apartment. He picked up the phone and was still working. And he called his wife, who was just a couple of feet away on the other side, because she was blonde and she looked like an Aryan. And she was one of the spies that we heard about. And he said goodbye to her. Very dramatic thing. So yes, there were families, there were women. Even after the Great Deportation, when there were only 60,000 people left, they knew what was coming, but they also knew they had to live a life. And as today, even a lot of that falls on the shoulders of the women. Anybody else?
I don't know, in terms of books, I was a librarian. I know there is a young adult book, it's fiction, but it's about a non-Jewish, the being that it's a young adult, a teenage young man who finds out his father is smuggling things into the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then he helps his father, and it's by an Israeli author. I can't remember his name right now, but is there like at Yad Vashem, like a book list that I guess, and maybe.
Sure, it's one of the most written about periods of the war. What I would suggest is just Google, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Warsaw Ghetto, and you'll get many hundreds of books, right? And many of them you can read on a Kindle or something like that.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah. Were there uprisings in other ghettos?
Yes, in many ghettos. But I would say if I were to, Bialystok had, yes, there were many other ghettos, but the significant difference was that Warsaw, as I mentioned, was able to capture the support of the vast majority of the people living in the ghetto, whereas in other places they were unable to do that. In Bialystok, for example, they did not have the support. And then you got into an issue of the fear of the population, because if the people fought against the Germans took it out directly on the population of the ghetto. So there was a tremendous moral, angst that these people went through. But in the Warsaw Ghetto, what made it very unique was that it really had the support of the population. But yes, there were many, many rebellions, and in concentration camps too.
A question about the arms that they were able to purchase. It seemed like they really got fleeced by the Poles for pistols and bullets. But this came kind of late in the story. They still had money left. Who arranged for the purchase?
They still had communication. So it was a lot going on. First of all, the Poles didn't think the Jews had any chance. So they didn't want to give them weapons. There was tremendous anti-Semitism among the resistance on the other side of the wall. They didn't want to help the Jews because they weren't terribly unsympathetic to what the Germans were doing. They did get money from the world Jewish community through Switzerland, through smuggling, through gold, through stones. In other words, this was a very significant community before the war, and they had resources that they were able to smuggle in, and they used all those resources, to procure what little weaponry they could. But a lot of it did come from the joint and Jews outside of Poland.
Yeah, I thought I heard the speaker at one point say that through London that the Polish.
Well, he was referring to the Polish government in exile. The Polish government in exile was located in London, and again, they were not super helpful because they didn't feel they had limited resources, and they didn't feel it was worthwhile investing in the Jews. They had never known Jews to fight like that. Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you, Barbara. Everyone, thank you for inviting me. As always, it's a pleasure to speak to you. Keep learning, and have a good summer. And I hope everyone stays healthy.
You too.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.